Okay, the Ninth Amendment was part of the Bill of Rights that was enacted by the United States after the Constitution itself was enacted. What had happened is the Constitution itself created what was perceived as a pretty strong central government. That was in response to the earlier failure of the Articles of Confederation. It had not been a strong enough central government. So the new Constitution created a stronger central government. Then people started getting nervous that we were giving too much power to the central government. We need to be sure to protect our personal rights as individuals. So the Bill of Rights, of which the Ninth Amendment is one, was passed, was enacted to guarantee that the government could not do certain things to people. It was intended to be a protection against government action. And so the Ninth Amendment, what they did in the Bill of Rights was create a sort of a laundry list of things that, the government couldn't pass laws that limited our freedom of speech or freedom of religion. They couldn't enact laws that would result in taking away firearms from people. They couldn't enact laws that allowed people to be searched without probable cause. So they had a whole laundry list of rights that the Bill of Rights was intended to give us. And then they got to the Ninth Amendment and they said, well, there's still some other rights out there. We don't know maybe exactly how to phrase them or how to write them down, but we know there's some other rights out there that people ought to have. And so we're going to pass the Ninth Amendment, which says even though we've made this laundry list, that's not all the rights that you have. There may be other rights that you still have that the government can't take away from you. So that's where the Ninth Amendment comes into play. Well, the Ninth Amendment hasn't necessarily been a real big target of litigation. The biggest effect that it's had is developing in the federal Constitution, along with a couple of the other amendments, what you would refer to as a right of privacy that says the government can't. The right of privacy is that just the right to be left alone by the government, that they can't come in and tell you you've got to do certain things a certain way. And there were several cases back in the 60s that they used the Ninth Amendment to develop this federal right of privacy. Now, the Montana Constitution has a right of privacy. Right in the Constitution, it says you have a right of privacy. The federal Constitution doesn't have that. So the U.S. Supreme Court had to look at these other rights and think, well, the Ninth Amendment says we have other rights, and we think that there ought to be a right of privacy, so we're going to create a right of privacy, and we're going to use the Ninth Amendment as part of the basis for that. So that gives us a right of privacy in some of our personal things, how you raise a family, the whole reproductive rights issue, including abortion, contraceptive rights, rights between same-sex partners. Those all get premised on a federal bill of, or on the Ninth Amendment, which forms the federal right of privacy. So it affects a lot of people in a lot of ways through those kinds of court decisions. Okay. Well, unlike some of the later amendments, those first 10 amendments came in as a group. So we never really had a vote separately on the Ninth Amendment. The Bill of Rights was presented as a collective group. So it's kind of hard to pull out the Ninth Amendment and say, well, we didn't have this, what would things be right? But what would things be like? But like, as I was just explaining, the Ninth Amendment forms the federal basis of a right of privacy. So the United States, we would have a very different world in the United States if there wasn't a federal right of privacy. The federal government could, or the state governments could do any number of things, and they tried to do any number of things. It used to be against the law in some states for married couples to get contraceptives. Now that's married couples, that's not unmarried couples. That's married couples desiring to control their family planning, and it was against the law for them to get contraceptives until the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, that's a right of privacy. That's something that should just be between a husband and a wife and in their family decision making. The government shouldn't have any say in that. That's something that should be hands off. So there's been a lot of laws that they've used the Ninth Amendment again as part of the right of privacy to say, no, government, you've got to stay out of this area. This is something that's private to people. The government has no business sticking its nose in that part of our life. And so if we didn't have the Ninth Amendment, I don't know if we would get to a federal right of privacy, because that was a big part of the federal right of privacy. I think as you read the newspaper and you see a lot of reference to the Second Amendment, which is your right to bear arms. You see a lot of reference to your freedom of religion, that's one of the First Amendments, or your freedom of speech, that's one of the First Amendments. You may see some reference to the right to not have your house searched or your person searched without reasonable cause, that's the Fourth Amendment. In court, we see a lot of cases where the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination comes up. You don't hardly ever see people marching around out there holding up, protect my Ninth Amendment rights. It just doesn't really catch a lot of people's attention. It's that collective statement that you've got these other rights. We don't know what they are, but they're out there. So I'm not sure how people perceive the Ninth Amendment. I think maybe most of the people don't know what the Ninth Amendment says. And so this is good why you're doing this. Because the Ninth Amendment says that despite our laundry list of rights that you have, the people still retain other rights. And I think there could be some grounds for further litigation arguing that, although I can't think of any particular circumstance offhand. But I think most of the people don't know what the Ninth Amendment says, and it's not one of those popular amendments. Second Amendment rights. I got my Second Amendment rights. I got my First Amendment rights. People don't walk around saying, "Hey, I got my Ninth Amendment rights." It's a little bit of a vague amendment, is what it comes down to. Well, I think there's been a lot of controversy lately about government spying on us. They're tracking our phone records. They've got all these programs out there to intercept our emails and that sort of stuff. There's a constant struggle between some people who want government to be stronger and people who want government to back off more. Again, the Ninth Amendment, with that summary statement that you've got all of these rights that even though they're not listed specifically in the Constitution, you still have them. I think people need to care about that. I think, I'm a citizen of the country, and I get nervous with a government that feels like it can intrude into parts of my life that I don't think they have a right to intrude into. I think I ought to be able to send an email pretty much anywhere. I think I ought to be able to say pretty much anything I want to say. I think I ought to be able to write down anything I want to write down without having the government intercept that and maybe make a record of it, keep a record of it somewhere that I said something to somebody. That's not the government's role. The government isn't separate from us. We are supposedly the government. So when you turn around the government and it starts to spy on its citizens, that causes me a lot of concern. So I would want people to be aware of that federal right of privacy and the state right of privacy that the Ninth Amendment protects and supports, and these other rights. Our country is a unique experience in the history of the world because we are a self-governing body. We were the first truly self-governing body that came along with a written constitution. And there is a constant struggle between the power of the government and the rights of the individual. And I'm concerned that balance in that struggle between those two ideas is kind of leaning more toward the government. And I would want it to back off a little bit. I think the government does more than they ought to be doing. We've got this war on terrorism, which seems to be an open-ended war. And so with that justification, they say, well, we've got to spy on people so we know if there's going to be any terrorist attacks. Well, I think that they've gone too far in that. I think that we need to be aware that our government is intended to be a limited government. We are intended to have rights, with specific rights under the Constitution. And those aren't just words on paper. That's the way we live, and that's the way we ought to live, and that's what a self-governing people ought to be able to do. And so I think we should care about our Bill of Rights. We should care about the Ninth Amendment, its protection of our right of privacy.